from being a university student with no thought of entering the priesthood to becoming a Catholic priest. Father Rob Johnson shares the story of his faith journey. This is God Unites, finding spiritual unity in religious diversity. Welcome to God Unites, where we explore spiritual kinship with people of diverse religious backgrounds and perspectives. The central premise of this program is that while religious beliefs and doctrines among people may differ, we are all children of the same God, and as we draw closer to God, we draw closer to each other. The Spirit of God unites. Today, in that spirit, our guest is Father Rob Johnson, a Catholic priest serving in Maryville, Illinois. Father Rob, welcome to God Unites.
Thanks, David. Very good to be with you.
Father Rob, I listened to a podcast that was produced by the diocese in which you shared this story of the spiritual process of your decision to become a priest, which started while you were a student at the University of Illinois. And I thought as I listened to that is an interesting backstory that I would love to share in this podcast. So why don't we start there? Now, as I understand it, you went to the University of Illinois, like I did, as a undergrad student with no thought of becoming a priest. Tell us about that, and then what happened to change the trajectory?
Sure. Yeah, I did my undergrad in Champaign at the University of Illinois. I have a biology degree from there, and I grew up in a Catholic house. My mom and dad practiced, and but when I went to school, faith in general was just it wasn't really. I didn't have a hostility towards it or anything like that, but it just wasn't something that I thought maybe added much meaning to my life. It was just kind of a non-hostile apathy towards it. So like my freshman year in Champaign, I was lucky enough, there was a couple guys at the fraternity house that would go to mass on Sundays. And I would say like most of the time, but certainly, faith in general just wasn't something that I took very seriously. And it was really then through the course of several years, mostly in my undergraduate years, that, it's things as simple as there was between the fraternity house and then one of the girls' dorms, we had a co-ed softball team. And several of the people that I became good friends with on that team just took their faith very, very seriously. And I noticed that they were very happy. They helped me to be better, helped me to want to be a better man. And there was a couple Catholics, and most of them would have been more like a non-denominational Christian. And that was really the experience that got me thinking about like, I wonder if there's something more to faith in general that's not just superstitious or makes us feel good. But if there's something here that I like to really live out, and then just through what I believe to be God's providence in my life, one of the guys that was a year ahead of me, that he is actually a Catholic priest now as well, and he started a Bible study in the fraternity house, and I started to go to that, and I would just take questions. Like I didn't know a lot about my faith at all, and ended up going on a retreat one weekend, and and just had, I guess how it would boil down in that process, the most easy way to say it would be the more that I lived out my faith, the happier that I was. And then it was just a slow process then of, okay, I would start to go to mass every Sunday. And then, for me, I went back to, I went back to confession and started doing that on a regular basis. And, again, it was just this continual thing. I had good friends had a lot of fun. And the more that I lived out my faith, the more seriously I took it, actually, the more fun life became and the happier I was.
I'd like to explore a little bit of that a little deeper.
Sure.
Like there's some people listening who may not know what you mean when you say you were going to Mass.
Oh, sure. Yep.
So for the benefit of those who are not aware, could you explain just what that is?
Oh, yeah, happy to. So Mass, when someone who's Catholic says that they go to like church on Sunday, they would be going to Mass then. And so we believe that, that's the, trying to think of how to word it. But when I say going to Mass, I would mean going to church. And
it's a worship service. That's helpful.
Sure.
Yeah. And what is the central part of that?
Well, in our belief, it would be, and this is kind of a classical definition of it, but you would be there and experience both meal and sacrifice. And so it's rooted in our belief as Catholics in the person of Jesus and who he is, that he reveals himself to us as God, and he offers himself to us as the sacrifice that reconciles us to God. And so when someone goes to Mass, that particular worship service, we believe that you receive Jesus in the Eucharist or the Blessed Sacrament. You may have heard it referred as.
Or sometimes called communion.
Or you take communion, sure. And we believe that there's a substantial presence of Jesus in that communion, so that we're fed spiritually because he's there present, offering himself as a sacrifice. So, and the experience of it was, going, there is a ritual to it that you become familiar with. And even, the prayers that you say, the actions that your body does during it, of sitting and standing and kneeling at different parts, that becomes part of then this authentic worship that we have.
There is a structure to all of this, as you've alluded to. Mm-hmm. Some will vary, and some is the same each time. If somebody were to come to a Mass as a visitor, mm-hmm. Would they feel uncomfortable because they're not familiar with the rituals, or is this something where a person could just simply come and observe and feel comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I think if someone would feel comfortable, I think would be subjective to the person, but they would certainly always be welcome to come and even just observe. I know people that have done that, that may have an interest or an inkling to explore Catholicism, or just someone that wants to learn about a different faith or different denomination. So certainly, very, very welcome always. And, I think anything new, there is always a chance of being uncomfortable. Like I've had even friends of mine right after college, when a lot of our friends were getting married, some were Catholic, some were not. And I remember that was always a joke sometimes of, for someone that wasn't Catholic, they never knew what exactly to do when, whereas someone that grew up Catholic, it's almost like muscle memory that then takes over. So that's how I would answer that, of like, certainly, more than welcome always.
And somebody can just be an observer and watch.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you, however, were not just an observer. You were a participant. You were there as part of a worship service. Now,
sure.
Okay, you're a student at the University of Illinois, and you've characterized yourself, I think, be fairly stated as having a religious background, but not particularly religious, and yet you would go to Mass. Mm-hmm. Why? What drew you there?
Well, I think a couple things. In my earlier years there, it was just the reality of that's how I had grown up. Like there was a practice there. Like it was, my parents had instilled that to us, that it was important. So that's what initially would have taken me. And then, as I was saying before, the experience of going, I just found myself to be happier. And also, I mean, the unique experience of my time in Champaign that I'm very, very thankful for was I had people around me that I could take questions to, and then I would get good answers. So, I mean, just about anything, faith in general, but even something, specifically about the mass of going, it could ask like, well, why do we believe that like this is so important? Or like, what does it mean that we say this, like that this happens at Mass? And then, it was almost to my surprise, there were very good answers that I got. So there was, there was certainly like an intellectual side of it that was like intriguing to me, that it was, and I'm happy to explain more on this if this doesn't make sense, but there was this experience of like, wow, this is a smart religion. And I didn't have any connotations that it wasn't before, but I think that's something that you maybe grow up with implicitly, at least for people my age, to hear that like, oh, well, faith is like simplistic, or it's, just kind of wishful thinking or something like that. I mean, there's undercurrents of that, I think, that are very, very present, as they always have been. And so there was that experience that I would call more intellectual, to say like, wow, this is like there's reasons of like why things happen the way that they do. And there's an engagement of the intellect. It's a smart religion.
Now, I just to interpret that and on what I'm hearing,
Sure.
is that this is a period of time when, instead of just kind of going through the motions when you're at home, you go with your family. Now you're on your own. You have to make
Sure.
your own decision, and you're going at first. But it's also a time when you're asking questions. Why?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Why? And you're finding answers, and you're asking questions about life in general. One of the things you talked about, you've mentioned several times, is the word joy. I'd like to explore that, if you don't mind, just a little bit more. First, you're seeing this in others, but then you started to experience it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we're talking about here are the fruits of the gospel. The Savior said, by their fruits ye shall know them. So what sort of fruits were you experiencing that kept, I mean, they must have tasted good because you wanted more, and you kept going back. Could you talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think in a lot of ways, very, kind of general and basic way to say it is, I did find like a growth in joy and happiness in my own life. And I think to me that was always very deeply connected to like a deeper sense of purpose and meaning. And again, I think part of that too is good answers to authentic questions, of like that question of why, and the opportunity to maybe ponder some of the deeper questions that life brings about. And so I think that experience of joy, to me, it was never like, tell me if this needs to be explained anymore, but it wasn't a happy-go-lucky thing necessarily of like, oh, okay, everything's just fine all the time. But there's actually a way to engage like how hard life can be, and like some of those deeper ponderings that then you have almost in a sense like a narrative structure that you can see yourself in. And there's this beautiful integration of meaning then, and to say like, wow, I'm part of something that is both personal but also bigger than myself. And so there's like this transformation of the way that you see, at least I saw the world, to say, man, in many ways, especially as a college student, I believe I was told implicitly, like, nothing you do really matters. You know, you can kind of go and discover yourself or find your own way and all of that. And I just didn't find that satisfying, you know, I think deep down ever. Whereas this was a worldview that came with this experience that all of a sudden, no, everything matters. And my life has meaning and my decisions have consequences, not in a harsh way of like weighing you down, but in a sense that like, wow, there's a real, as I'm learning who I am in this identity, like there's a real mission that comes with this that allows then, yeah, I would say like for a very deep like joy and sense of purpose in life.
Well, you're talking about something more than just a happy time. You're talking about something that
sure.
runs deeper.
Mm-hmm.
You seem to be talking about finding purpose, that a life is meaningful, that your life is meaningful, and feeling drawn to that, and finding that the more you pursued that thread, so to speak, the more you found, the more you tasted of the fruit, the more you wanted more, and the sweeter it was becoming. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, sure.
Now, you were surrounded at the university by people who were searching for, what life's all about and pursuing it in a lot of different ways, some constructive and some not so constructive. And so in many ways, you were blessed to be on a path that was leading you someplace, but at that point, you really weren't aware of where that path was leading you. If I have your story correct.
Sure.
So what happened along the way that made you more than just a better Catholic, a better child of God? Something happened along the way, and it was a developmental process. Could you tell us about that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And for me, there was never one like specific moment that I point to. I mean, there's a few bigger moments that I would say, okay, that's a big like turning point in my life, but there was never kind of one great epiphany moment of like everything was just laid out in front of me or anything like that. It was, it's just a long, slow process. And in the vocabulary that I have around it, it would be this experience both of God as another, like, that God isn't, he's not just like a man somewhere out there in the sky. He's not a supreme being. And he's also not just, a projection of the perfect human being that comes from my own psyche or anything like that. But there's this experience of God as another, and it's been revealed in this person of Jesus. And it was really, why I say that background is like, I would say in that process, I got to know Jesus as a friend. And in that, I was around specific people and circumstances, especially towards the latter part of my time in Champaign. Just got to be friends with a couple of the priests that served at the Newman Center, which was the Catholic parish or church on campus there. And one of them in particular, we just got to know each other. I would serve mass for him. We would work out at the gym, together. And he was like in his mid 30s or so at the time. And I remember like, I still was not, thinking of being a priest at the time. But I remember that was when it started to enter into my mind that, wow, like these priests that I'm around, like they're very good and joyful men. Like they're normal in a way, and they just have this beautiful life of sacrifice and service to God and his people. And so that notion, it just started to grow in me, if I could say it in a simple way, that like I've experienced priesthood as a very joyful life. And then I worked as a missionary through a campus ministry organization. And I went to Lincoln, Nebraska after my time in Champaign, and I worked a couple years. And it was similar. I was around very, very good priests out there. And I just found myself starting to think about it a lot. And it would come up in my prayer to say, like, wow, what would it be like to like, and again, this is Catholic lingo, but like, what would it be like to hear someone's confession and offer them absolution? Or what would it be like to celebrate Mass? Or what would it be like to preach a homily, which is the sermon at Mass? And that just started to grow in me. I don't really have words on it past that.
Prior to this, had you been thinking about marriage, family, and a different trajectory in that sense in your life?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I always thought, the plan was to hopefully end up back by home and, married with a big family. That was certainly the desire throughout. And even once I started to think about priesthood, that was still a very, very real desire. If you were studying to be a priest and you didn't still have that desire, something would be wrong then, because it's a very beautiful calling from God. And so it's really, it was kind of surprising to me in a way, because that's what I had always wanted, certainly. And there was always an attraction to that and a desire for that. But the notion and the desire for priesthood just continued to grow in my heart during those years.
Was that surprising?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, less and less as time went on, especially being around very good priests. But certainly if you would look at, if I would go back and think of myself as a freshman in college, it'd be shocking.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And then I got to the point really with that thought, I was just thinking about it a lot and had the opportunity, dated a couple really, really great gals. And, there's one in particular that I was still thinking about, like, man, it would just like that call to priesthood is just there. And I was finally, just to the point of like, I need to go. Seminary is where you go to study to be a priest at a Catholic seminary. And, it was, and it's interesting in that process, when a guy joins the seminary, I mean, there needs to be some things there. Like there's a pretty stringent evaluation process. Obviously you need to think it's an authentic call to at least go and explore it. And you can't be living a double life or anything like that. But I was very honest of like, I don't know if this is for me. It's just something that like, I believe God has continued to put on my heart that I really need to go and take this seriously. And I was very encouraged. Like, I think that was a very healthy spot, actually, it's a long process to study to be a priest. And part of that is just, making sure that you're doing it in complete freedom and you're not being forced into it. So it took, even once I joined the seminary, I mean, it took another 2.5 or 3 years before I was really ready to say, no, I think this is for me. Like, I think this is both what God is calling me to, but I think this is how he formed my heart, that this is what I want to do. That I still have these desires to be married and have a big family. And I mean, so many other things. But it was just, that was the love. Priesthood was the love that I wanted to center my life around. Similar to when, a guy gets married, in a sense, like he's saying no to a lot. He's saying no to everything else in the world besides that one particular woman and his family. And, that was a similar experience of, I was excited to give my life in that way.
Well, that's a good analogy to marriage. You say, if you're a man, you say no to all the other women
Sure.
in the world, and you say yes to the woman you marry.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, I mean, you mentioned earlier sacrifice and service. Now, I think when people think of sacrifice, they think of something very negative. And yet the definition of sacrifice is to give up something of value for something of greater value. So, otherwise
Yeah.
you wouldn't do it. So,
Yeah, and I would actually, my understanding of sacrifice too was, even like the definition I've always heard, it just comes from the breakdown of the word of sacra and officio, means to literally make something holy. So when I say sacrifice there, it's not a deprivation. It's like an ordering in order to make something holy, which does involve saying no, but like the focus is not, it's not negative in the sense of like rooted in what something is being given up, but it's like, hey, this proper ordering in order to make something holy.
now I made reference to this podcast that the diocese published, and in that you talked about holiness and feeling a call to holiness. Mm-hmm. Could you explain that, elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So the vocabulary there really comes from, like in our Catholic tradition, like that would be very centered, and it's always been present, but the vocabulary was really emphasized in what's called the Second Vatican Council, which was a very big church council for the global Catholic Church in the 1960s. And then after that, that was when Pope John Paul II was Pope in the Catholic Church. He would talk about that again and again, of like a vocation or a calling from God is rooted in holiness, which would ultimately be you becoming who God created you to become. Another, like the vocabulary I like to use around it would be holiness for us is really an attachment to Jesus. It's not like moral or spiritual heroism necessarily, but it's this attachment to Jesus that's present and available to you at any time of your day. So in order to be holy, you may not be like destined or called to go out and do these massive, like, world changing things, even though you see some people that do that well. I would actually hold that a John Paul II was someone that, for a Catholic or a non-Catholic, that you may be able to view that as like lived out on a global scale. And there's other examples of that. But oftentimes holiness, or that, becoming who God created you to be, that can be lived out in, caring for your family and doing dishes and doing the laundry and kind of being attentive to those daily responsibilities that are entrusted to you.
It's a play on words, but as you're sharing that, I can't help but think about holiness, HOLINESS, and wholeness, WHOLENESS. You seem to be describing that, to becoming who you really are and who God intends for you to be. And it's a progressive process. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, anyway, so you're going through this process, process of study, but also exploration. Tell us where that led.
Yeah, I mean, it was really a process of growth and like formation in a lot of ways. It entailed study. It entailed a lot of human formation, and along with spiritual and intellectual as well, and then just pastoral. And that process, to me, it was of the many, many blessings that were involved in it, was just being able to be around a couple of very good priests that had a very, very big impact on me. And it was just a continuation of the same thread that, I started to experience and really put a name on when I was in college of, okay, the more that, as imperfectly as I do it, the more that I try to live my faith authentically and follow the call that God has for me, actually, the more, I don't know if this is too vague, but it's the more that like you're almost given yourself. You really start to know yourself and who you are. And so that was the experience for me in this, and it had ups and downs. Like I said, that was always like very strong desire to be married. And that was like, man, do I really want to do this? Do I really feel a pull to do this? And just slowly over time, there was this, what I believe was a personal like relationship with God that allowed me to really come to believe like, no, this is for me. And then to continue that process. You do, it's not easy in the process, and it's not supposed to be. Like, you have to grow a lot and you learn a lot. And, but it was very, like, the process was very good, for me. I had very good years, studying and being in formation.
So let me ask you a question. This
Sure.
may be on the minds of some who are listening.
Mm-hmm.
Is God real?
I believe so. Yes.
Why?
Well, I mean, I can answer that personally of like, I have just found, him to be present and active in my life. And, I think the other way to maybe get at that is just to engage like our intellect and reason, and to say, no, there's something in the human experience of being able to look out at the world and see that there is like a sense of order there. And there's so many other ways you could like try and answer that, like the why of that. But ultimately, I would answer it in the personal way of like, I believe that because I believe I've experienced like him and his providence in my life.
Well, that experience is something that's tangible, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, sure. And
it's real.
Yeah, absolutely. And the experience element is subjective to me, in that experience. It's a personal experience. But then, like, when you say tangible there, like I
spiritually
always
tangible.
No, I think of that in terms of, no, there's still ways to look at in an objective way to say like, no, hey, there's something there in understanding that God is real. And so while the experience will always be subjective to an extent, you can use that, what is tangible and concrete there, to distill. And then I would always encourage people, like way back to what I was saying before of, the tradition, and this would be specifically speaking from a Catholic perspective, but I think you could say just a Christian perspective in general of, you have now 2,000 years of like, different traditions, like trying to articulate this and examples and, really, really profound and good thought put into it. So anyway, there's just kind of something that came up there at the end in thinking about that of, you don't have to figure it out on your own, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. And maybe it's as simple as like finding someone that you trust that can, authentically answer your questions. I think that's very, very helpful in that.
Well, you're talking there about, seems to me, almost two parallel tracks. One of them is the mind, where you're trying to understand God, at least as much as we're capable of, and trying to understand the things of God. But the other thing is that you're experiencing something. You talked about a relationship, and it's more intangible. It's not something that you can simply think your way to, but you've experienced it. And so when you say you were developing a relationship with God, relationship implies something that is interactive. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think if I heard you right there, I would say, the only, and I think this is what you were saying as well. But the experience that's important there is that the head part, like the intellectual part, is not in competition with the heart part. Like, at least that was my experience as well. Of no, like we're given an intellect, and so it's not that we just have this, experience where like we think ourselves to faith or anything like that. It is integrated in what we experience, and but to me, the relationship would be all of that. Like, that's what allows it to be personal. Then with who we believe a personal God is. Does that make sense there?
Well, I think so. It's very difficult to put
Sure.
into words.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe before I lose this this thread of thought, I wanted to loop back. You talked about confession.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is back in your college years.
Sure.
You said you decided to go to confession, and you seem to be saying that you had an experience, a spiritual experience through that. So could we talk about that? And I don't want to get too personal.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But was confession a regular part of your worship experience when you first started at the University of Illinois?
No, not when I started. Actually, I always joke in a way. I almost got like, and this isn't, I don't mean this literally, but in a way I joke that I got tricked into going to confession. Like, I got invited on a retreat, and I did not know that at the time there was going to be different priests there to hear confessions. And even in that, like, I would look back and view very much God's providence at work of, like during that time with other students and some missionaries. And anyway, so I'm there, didn't really know what it was or what it was going to entail. Just the guy at the fraternity that was a year ahead of me that was leading the Bible study, he convinced me to go, and was not like pressured in any way to go to confession, but it was through that of like, man, I think I haven't been to confession in years, and I think I want to go. And so I did, and went and sat down, and just brought a lot of years of stuff that had been kind of pent up and had some shame around, and didn't really know what was going to happen because I hadn't been in so long.
And just for those who aren't familiar, you're going to sit down and you're going to share these things. You're going to unburden, so to speak, with a priest.
Exactly. Yep. And I remember kind of looking down, thinking like, gosh, I don't know if like he's going to tell me to go home, if he's going to be mad or anything like that. And I looked up because he was quiet and he was smiling. The priest was, and he just said, "Hey, burden is lifted." And I remember that experience to me, like looking back through that particular priest and through what we call the sacrament of confession. Like, that was a real experience of God in my life, of being both personal and very, very merciful, of like wanting to be there for us and with us.
Now, that's why I asked the question, because that's not something intellectual. That's something you experience. Now, you can ask why. I mean, what makes this work? It's kind of like electricity. My dad was an electrical engineer. And
sure.
You say, okay, we can't see electricity, but we can observe all sorts of things about it, and we learned how it works. And that was something you experienced about God. You may not have understood. How does this work? But it was real. And that was part of what was leading you further. But now the world is full of people all around us carrying burdens like you were. But you experienced, what were the words you used? It was an unburdening.
Oh yeah. The priest said, burden lifted.
And did you feel it lifted?
Yeah, I did. It did, in that moment. It's kind of hard to like put into words, the experience of it. But I know that there was an experience of, okay, I want other people to experience that. Yeah. And I think though, and this is part of like, this is why it's so hard to, kind of articulate, because like there was this sense of like, no, something was real there and happened like to me. So it was never a desire for someone else to feel that particular thing. It was a desire for someone to be given like what happened to me, which in that moment, if that makes any sense.
It does. And there are two thoughts that come to mind. One, you used the word merciful.
Mm-hmm.
And so here you were liberated, so to speak, from things that had been burdening you.
Mm-hmm.
And it was done in a way that was loving. It was merciful. And it's interesting that your response to that you've described is a desire for others to feel that. Now, I'll tell you, that to me is something that is a mark, a characteristic of this experience with God, which is, it's like, using the analogy of fruit again. You tasted the fruit and then have a desire, this is good. This is really good. I want to share this with others. And that could lead in a number of different ways, but at some point it led you to sacrifice everything else for something you felt called to do that was better, higher for you personally, not necessarily for everybody, but for you personally. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that point at which you really reached the decision point. Am I going to actually do this and become a priest?
Well, I had been studying, I think 2 full years, maybe 3 years. And yeah, I knew at that point that I had a deep like love and reverence for the priesthood in general. And yeah, I mean, it was just, there was a particular moment I was sitting in prayer, and I knew in that moment that like this is what God wanted for me, and this is what I wanted as well. And there's really not words like past that. Saint Ignatius calls sometimes those are a gift given like moments of clarity. And that's really what it was. Like, I mean, a fruit or a marker of that was that there was no doubt after it crept in. I mean, there's always temptations. There's always like, oh, the grass could be greener on the other side. That's part of being human. But there was, after that one particular moment, it was just so like clear and firm, which was a real gift. It was a very real grace of like, nope, this is for me.
Yeah. And it's not natural.
How and so? Yeah.
When I say that, just it's human nature to be anything but have that clarity in your mind. I mean, human nature, you can make a decision and all of that, but there's buyer's remorse, there's all this, there's the back and forth. But to have that clarity, given the gravity of what you were committing yourself to me is something that is unnatural. And to me, as I hear you say that, an evidence of that it's real and it's not from you. It's not something self-generated because it's It's not natural in the sense of human nature. I guess that's, if I'm expressing that right. And so what happened next?
Well, I was already in formation at that point, and so it was just nice to be able to go back. I had a few years left before I was going to be ordained a priest, and what happened next is I was still the same guy. I was still struggled with the same things and had the same interest, but it did allow for like, okay, this is my particular state of life that I believe, the Lord is calling me to. So it allowed some things to maybe seem simpler in some ways. I'm in my 30s, and at least this has been my experience, and watching my siblings and friends of, as you get older, in some ways your life gets smaller, which is a really good thing. Like, responsibilities start to become clearer of, hey, this is my calling and mission in life here.
Smaller in the sense of focus.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. And so it was just nice in that moment to say, okay, like this is it. So a few years later, I was ordained a priest and started in, then life as a priest, and here I am today.
Now, as a priest, you have interaction with people who you probably have thoughts that this person reminds me of me, or
sure.
Things of that sort. But now it's you that is on the other side of confession, for example. What does that feel like? Let's take confession, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I would say more generally, just the experience of being a priest. There's a lot of moments of like, wow, I get to do this today, or moments of, in a sense, even thinking back to the high school version of me, early college, of like, I just can't believe I'm a priest, honestly. Some days, what does it feel like? I think, it's just a day-to-day thing of like, there's good days and there's bad days, and there's days that are like really busy, and everything like that, just like any experience of life. But there is a very real sense of, like, okay, I'm where, even if today wasn't like the best day ever, or anything like that, there's still this experience of like, man, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And that, that is very, certainly something I'm very thankful for.
And devoting yourself to a life of service, I'm curious as to whether you experience God as part of that, as being used as an instrument or otherwise something that happens in your relationship to God while you are in the process of service.
Yeah, I think you could maybe ask that again. What are you asking there? Sorry.
Well, you are serving others, but you're also serving God.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you experience God in your service as a priest?
Yeah, how I'd answer that, I think, just as as a friend, of like present, and there's kind of a both and notion of like, it's deeply mysterious of, I think I certainly grow in relationship with God, like daily in life as a priest. And I also think there's an element that, I believe like, no, like God is working through me, in this. And, anyway, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, having experienced what it feels like for God to work through me, it's quite humbling.
Sure.
It's something that on many occasions I've recognized is not from me. Now, in my religion, in my church, I hold the priesthood. We don't go through the same process that you do. But as part of that, there are occasions for me to lay my hands on someone's head and to exercise that priesthood to give them a blessing. And when I do that, I virtually every time just feel this love from God flow into me and through me to that person, which I struggle to put into words and hope that they are feeling that spirit. But that's not self-generated. And sometimes words, well, often, words that come, thoughts that formulate, that are unexpected to me, where I recognize this is not me. God is doing something through me, and I'm as much an observer or a conduit than an active participant. And yet, if I wasn't there, this person wouldn't be having quite that experience. And now that doesn't mean that God needs me, but he uses me, and it's a privilege for me to be in that position. And so it blesses me. So I need that, and am blessed by it, along with the person who's receiving the blessing, just using it in that context, but a number of other contexts. So that was the kind of thing I was thinking about. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a, in some ways I probably do fall into this thinking in some ways that I'm not conscious of it, but I think clearly, it's never a quid pro quo relationship with God. Like, it's kind of this awe of like, wow, like he really is like, yeah, whether it's working through me, whether it's with me, something I've received, just by like trying to be faithful to him. No, that's constantly present there, certainly.
Well, I really appreciate your sharing these things. I know they're deeply personal, and
Oh, sure.
They're of a nature that it's not easy to just try to find words that would convey the full meaning of what you're trying to communicate. So
Sure.
We both pray that people who are listening will feel the Spirit of God themselves, and that if they want to understand the sort of things that you're trying to share and get answers in their lives, that they'll seek it in the same sort of way that you have and that I have, which is my own version of a path like you described. I can relate to what you've described. Mm-hmm. But now, as we wrap up here, if you were to share a message to people who may be seeking whether answers or seeking understanding or simply seeking a sense of purpose and direction in their lives, what would you share?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would share simply of, I believe, like the notion of being human is we all just innately know that like somehow our relationships are broken. And I think, you look at the world, and then I think any person can look at their own heart and say like, no, I've done things that have hurt people, and I've been hurt by other people who even I love. So we have this like experience of our relationships being broken, and that is who, like, I believe, like, in the person of Jesus, God came to like reconcile first our relationship with him, which allows us to like reconcile with each other. And we're also free in that. And so, as simple as that may sound, just to call that to mind, that like, no, it's okay to say the world isn't as it should be. And as those questions like like as we ponder those questions, like you don't have to figure that out alone. So just encourage people, like find someone that you find out to be like authentic in their witness of how they live their life, especially in terms of the faith that they practice. And it's okay to ask questions and be honest with doubts, and to not be afraid of those things, because the truth will always be able to stand in that. And so that's just kind of maybe the fervorino or the encouragement, as if you find yourself with doubts or questions, not to be discouraged by that, but to just ask for help, like in it, and then to be very patient and to pursue that.
I appreciate those thoughts very much. I think that when we stop asking questions, we stop receiving answers.
Sure.
So that would be a cause for some self-reflection if
Sure.
I were to stop asking questions. And that's what faith is. That's what if you had all the answers, it wouldn't be faith. But faith
Sure.
isn't blind either. It's based
Absolutely.
on evidence along the way, these experiences, the things that you've been describing, living a life of faith. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you, and I'm sure the listeners appreciate you sharing these deeply personal things with us. Now, as we started, as just a reflection, when we talk about these things, the language of religion differs from one person to another, from one faith to another, from one religion to another. But the Spirit, the language of the Spirit, seems to be something in common. And in this program, we try to get beyond the words, the language, the religious language, the language of religion, and to be able to communicate by the language of the Spirit. And I think we've experienced some of that today. So thank you very much.
Oh yeah. Thanks for having me, David.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of God Unites. For other episodes, please check our God Unites YouTube channel or visit our website at godunites.com for links to both the video and audio versions of this and other episodes. When you do, please follow or subscribe to our program. And on YouTube, hit the like button. And please help spread the word to others by sharing a link to our website with your friends on social media or on your own websites. This is God Unites,